Okay, perfect. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. So, welcome for the 17th lecture of the certificate program on migration governance and diaspora engagement. So today we are pleased to welcome Mrs. Joanne Irvin, who will deliver the lecture on migration and international agencies. So Joanne specializes in migration governance and sustainable development in the Migration and Sustainable Development Unit of Iom headquarters. Joanne has over 12 years of experience working with and supporting local and national governments, civil society, and UN organizations globally. Sorry, I cannot see the screen anymore. Globally, to maximize the development potential of migration in support of the 2030 Agenda. She now manages the IOM UNDP Global Joint Program on making migration work for sustainable development, which is working in 11 countries to showcase how mainstreaming migration into national and local policies contributes to local development results through the rollout of concrete initiatives led by cities, local, and regional authorities. Joanne is also part of the interdepartmental team within IOM, working to enhance the role and positioning of cities and local and regional authorities as key migration governance actors for local development, including supporting IOM's participation as a partner in the mayor's mechanism of the GFMD. She holds a joint undergraduate and Master of Arts in Hispanic Studies and French from the University of Glasgow, an MA in European Policy and International Development Cooperation from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, a Master in Migration, Co-Development and Public Participation from the Cultural and Social Studies Foundation of Valencia, and a diploma in human rights and forced migration from the United Nations University of Peace. Joanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, colleagues. I just want to check that you can see my PowerPoint and you can hear me okay.
Perfectly.
Perfect. And I'm always really embarrassed when people read out all the courses that I did. I was a bit of an obsessive student when I was younger. So it's lovely to be here. And I realize if you're saying that this is lecture 17, that you have had a lot of lectures, and I will try to make this interesting as possible. And I also want to say that as I go through the slides, you know, if you have covered something maybe that I missed in another slide, and you know you don't need to know it, please jump in, let me know. I can stop and explain more when needed, or I can skip things when needed, depending a little bit on your questions, what we prefer. I would like to keep this quite flexible, and I am sharing my screen fully, so I can't see the chat. So if someone could definitely tell me if there are, just, you know, jump in, or please, Karine, maybe you can tell me if there's a question, you can stop me. I'm happy to respond as needed, or of course we will make sure to have time at the end, of course, also, but I'm happy to also interrupt and answer questions or clarify anything that's not clear. So indeed, today I've been asked to talk to you within the context of this program on migration governance and international organizations. And I just wanted to, you know, very sort of quickly say that this looks like a lot of an agenda, but I'm going to basically try to give you a snapshot of migration governance and a little bit of the history of it and where it's came from and where it's going in relation to sustainable development. Then talk about why sustainable development is so important for migration and vice versa in terms of the 2030 Agenda. Talk about IOM as the UN Migration Agency, as one of these international organizations that works on migration, as well as, of course, diaspora, but also migration governance. Give you an example of something that we do in terms of joint work, and then look at some of the areas of like what other international agencies or organizations do in terms of migration, and what the opportunity of the UN reform around, you know, working better together across different international organizations and agencies to further this work and to really basically make migration work for sustainable development. And the reason why I say this is that, first of all, I think we need to sort of like just take a step back and think about where migration governance came from. Because migration governance has, you know, really over the years been something that has been very siloed and very separate from everything else that we do in relation to governance. Because it's a political issue, because of many other different reasons, we tend to have had, you know, over the years, you know, policies around migration and mobility and refugees, very separate in the governance system. And very led by specific parts of government, whereas all the other areas like, you know, sustainable development areas like education, employment and things like this have had their own kind of like area and really are meant for, of course, the full population within a country. And so this is kind of where I wanted to start off. And of course, first of all, maybe just a definition as well. You know, we define migration governance as the combined frameworks of legal norms, laws and regulations, policies and traditions, as well as organizational structures, including subnational, national, regional, international, and the relevant processes that shape and regulate states' approaches with regards to migration in all of its forms, addressing the rights and responsibilities of all actors, including migrants, including states, and promoting international cooperation in and on around migration governance. So it's very all-encompassing, clearly, and it's the crux of what IOM does, essentially. And before we just do the next few slides, I just wanted to ask you to, I presume you know about the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals, but I am going to ask you a question soon about migration and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I want you to maybe just in your browser, you know, go to the SDGs website, have a look at the different goals there, and just be reminded a little bit of that. Because one of the things that I wanted to kind of start with is talking a little bit about the 2030 Agenda and sustainable development itself. Why do we link migration and sustainable development? Why do we think that migration governance should be a key element of sustainable development aspects? And of course, you're probably very, very well aware of the fact that we are now in the 2030 Agenda, coming off of the Millennium Development Goals, where we have for the first time, you know, these targets and indicators concretely around 17 global goals, which includes everything in terms of related to people and related to prosperity in our economies, in relation to the environment in our planet, and relating to peace, and relating to partnerships as well for those goals. And so what I can, excuse me, what I kind of wanted to ask you is, what do you think are the most relevant sustainable development goals for migration governance in that sense? And you may have touched on some of this already. Please feel free I might need some help moderating the chat, but if it's easier to just write in thoughts, contradict me, pick your favorite SDG, anything you think in the chat. I just want to hear from some of you, excuse me, what your thoughts are on that. Sorry for coughing, colleagues. Karine, would you mind reading out some of the comments that are coming in for me, please?
So when it comes to the SDGs, we have SDGs 10.7, 17.5.8, 17 again, 3, 4, 5, 16, 10, 8, 16 again. And basically that's it. maybe I missed one, but basically, yes.
No problem. No, so there isn't really a sort of, to be honest, it was a bit of a trick question, really, because the way that we see it and the way that we are working towards migration governance for sustainable development is that, oops, can I just change? Is that actually migration impacts all of the sustainable development goals, and all of the development areas or sustainable development goals can have an impact on migration, because and I'll get into why this is. And the issue is that the fact that we got the 2030 agenda and that we have actually got, they have the recognition of the linkages between migration and how migration is governed under, and some of you said it, SDG 10, which is target 7 on safe, orderly and regular migration. So it's actually in there for the first time in the 2030 agenda. And so in there, I think what we wanted to sort of like point out is the fact that the safe and orderly and regular migration, even if it only comes under SDG 10, doesn't take away from the fact that unhealthy migrants can't work. And that's SDG 3 on health, SDG 8 on employment. Remittances coming from diaspora or migrants abroad. I'm so sorry. I have been in a few different webinars and things over the past 2 days, and I'm starting to lose my voice. The point being that across basically all the different SDGs, mobility is something that is cross-cutting. And actually the fact that it's included in the SDGs allows us to compare and allows us to understand and create better collaboration between different countries on migration. And it also allows us to explore the linkages between employment and migration, and health and migration, and environment and migration, and peace and migration, because it is such a cross-cutting issue that we can't really say that only 1 or 2 or 3 SDGs are relevant. In each country context, migration will be relevant across different SDGs for different reasons. And that's where we need to be working towards understanding how migration does affect these different areas and vice versa, so that we know how to do good migration governance, essentially. And so in the SDGs, as you can see, there are these like direct connections between migration and SDGs, as I already mentioned a few there, and I think some of you probably were thinking of those ones that officially are mentioned there, when you have things like, in the SDG for quality education, you have a whole target on student mobility. You have, sorry, you have SDGs 5 and 8 and 16, where we talk about human trafficking and exploitation and how to try to avoid that, of course, which obviously happens from a human mobility sense. We have lots of areas under SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth on labour migration and employment. We have the one that we just mentioned on migration governance. We have the remittances one that we mentioned, and we even have issues around how to get better data so that we can do better development, including by migratory status, which is under SDG 17. But the point is, these are just because these are the only places that migration is sort of explicitly mentioned, doesn't mean that all the SDGs are relevant for migration and sustainable development. And like, just to take one example, and we will look at other examples later on, in terms of climate action and SDG 13, and particularly in the context of having just had COP26, seeing that really needing to understand actually the impact that mobility has on the climate and land degradation sometimes, or just land in general, or urban sprawl, as well as the impact that climate degradation, climate change, environmental issues actually can have an impact on mobility. It can cause people to move, it can be displacement, it can be crisis and disasters, it can be slow onset movement because of poor farming lands and like issues around the rural kind of like subsistence, and so that which moves people from the rural areas to cities and potentially onwards to migration. And so if we don't consider the human aspect of the human mobility aspect around climate and what we're doing to mitigate climate change and what we're doing to in disaster risk reduction, how do we make sure that we include migrants when we actually are thinking about urban planning, resilience strategies around combating the impacts of climate change or environmental issues. then we are leaving those people behind. We are not able to support these people in an integral way. And this is just one example of how, even though there's no specific migration mentioned here, it's such a key issue for this particular SDG. And it can be said, the same can be said for quite a lot of different SDGs, basically. And so, in terms of IOM and sustainable development, so we are, of course, an international UN organization now. We were created in 1951, which was in and around the same year actually as the Geneva Conventions on Refugees. It was obviously in the throes of at the same time as creation of a lot of other different international organizations, UN agencies, etc. And we were actually created in the context of to support refugee resettlement and to support the movement of people to be resettled after the Second World War, essentially. And so we started off that way, but obviously IOM has grown a lot, and we do a lot in relation to migration governance. And as you can see here, our main mission statement is IOM supporting migrants across the world, developing effective responses to the shifting dynamics of migration, and as such, as a key source of advice on migration policy and practice. So we have, 174 member states, and we are present in over 100 countries. We have a lot, like over 500 country offices to support local and national authorities and different actors really, work on migration governance, essentially. We also, of course, work in the humanitarian, when I say migration governance, it's not only in a sort of development context, it's of course across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. So we work in areas like migration and development, which I'm talking to you a lot more today. We talk about facilitating migration, so things like labour mobility, bilateral labour agreements. We regulate migration in terms of making sure it's ethical recruitment. We talked about, protecting and mitigating trafficking in persons or smuggling. And we address also the areas of forced migration, so around displacement, around the area of refugees. We're not UNHCR, of course, so we're not the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We don't provide a refugee status, but when there is refugees with a refugee status, we can provide resettlement and support for those persons, or we can refer migrants who actually could apply for asylum to UNHCR or to state-led processes to do the process of applying for asylum, basically. And of course, now we are a proper UN-related agency since 2016, and we're part of the UN Sustainable Development Group. And we are also the coordinator of the UN Network on Migration for the implementation, review and follow-up of the Global Compact on safe and orderly and regular migration. So this is, we're basically the UN migration agency, although this does not mean that many other agencies and international organizations, of course, don't have a hand in migration governance, and we will talk about that in a little bit. And what I wanted, and apologies, because I think for some reason, I think the slide may have been cut out that I really wanted to show. And I'm going to ask my colleagues if they're listening to maybe reinsert the slide on the history, where I had put down all the different areas of migration governance. And if not, we'll come back to that at another point. But basically, what I wanted to the point I wanted to make with that slide, and apologies that it's been somehow deleted, is that if IOM was created, I'll go back to this one, if IOM was created in 1951, and as I mentioned, the whole migration governance system was very siloed, very separate. Everything we did in migration governance was like an additional thing, and it was about solving a problem. It was not considered as something that related to sustainable development or other areas of governance. And it actually took from 1951, I think, until about 42 years. And in those 42 years, there was all the other international human rights conventions and laws, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all these other, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right at the beginning of when we started thinking about international development, international cooperation, international laws and support. From there, it took 42 years just to have one specific convention on migrant workers, which is the International Convention for the Protection of Migrant Workers. And then even at that point, we took another 16 years just to get to the point where we actually had the first ever UN high-level dialogue on migration and sustainable development. So really, we've been, the entire international system had been working forwards on everything international cooperation, international human rights law for many, many years. And migration really was a very siloed aspect of that until basically the first high-level dialogue, as I mentioned, on migration and sustainable development, which took place in 2006. And then from there, it took another 10 years with a few different other things that happen in between. It took another 10 years to basically get to the point where we have the 2030 agenda in 2016, which basically said, oh yes, now we recognize that migration is support sustainable development and vice versa. And so, many, many years go by, 50, 60 years go by, and it's only now in 2016 that we had an official, member state UN General Assembly agreement that migration is related to sustainable development and vice versa. And so this was the point I wanted to make, in the sense that this is not something that this is something that we have been pushing for, promoting, and trying to make sure that becomes an integral part, that migration governance becomes an integral part of sustainable development and what we do. And for the reasons that I want to explain that relate to everything I just mentioned on the 2030 agenda. And so the IOM itself has also evolved as a UN agency, as a migration governance international organization. We now actually have our own migration and sustainable development strategy, and we have an action plan for that. Our member states approved it, and the whole idea around this was essentially making sure that now that we are a UN agency, now that officially a UN agency, we have always partnered with and been very much working with UN agencies, but we were never officially part of the UN. So now that we're officially part of the UN, now that we also hold the mandate for the Global Compact on migration, which is basically all about migration governance, then we need to make sure that the work that we do as IOM is absolutely supporting the commitments that we have to our member states to achieve the 2030 agenda. And the way that we do this, and you can see the little graphic here, I'm sorry it's a little bit blurry, this is kind of like our theory of change essentially, and the strategy, which, after this, and maybe my colleagues might put it in the chat for you, the actual link to the strategy itself, and we can share the PowerPoint and everything afterwards. But basically, the idea is that we are, really aiming at addressing inequalities, gender, environment, and climate change as cross-cutting issues in our work. That we want to make sure that human mobility is increasingly a choice, that migration is increasingly well governed, and that migrants and their families are empowered, so that our end game being that the potential of migration is maximized for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals for migrants and societies alike. So not just for migrants, but understanding that migrants form part of society, and that we should be working in that perspective, so that migration really is not just a siloed separate thing that's really politically annoying and a hot potato, but actually understanding that migration can be really positive with the right policies in place. And so let's integrate good migration governance into all other things we do on sustainable development and cooperation, so that this benefit we can actually harness essentially. And the reason is because migration and sustainable development, even if we haven't been talking about it for long enough, and even if we haven't, we've only recognized this link more officially in the 2030 agenda, like globally, migration since the dawn of time has been a coping mechanism, a development strategy for people everywhere around the world. These are just some key facts to give a little bit of understanding around that. 3.5% of the world's population, 5% of the world's population are international migrants before COVID-19, but we actually support and contribute up to 10% of global GDP. Looking at the economics of this, every additional 1% of immigration can actually boost GDP growth by 2% in destination countries if we put the right policies in place. the 13% of all the key workers in the EU, just even in the EU, are actually migrants, many women migrants, particularly constituting the majority of health workers. And I think in the context of COVID-19, we can completely understand the real necessity around protecting migrant workers and our health workers in general, but also recognizing that a lot of our health workers are actually migrants, and that they provide a key service not only in health, but they also provide a key service in agriculture, in food collection, in food processing and things like this. And so when COVID actually happened, we realized it was a terrible thing to happen, but it really highlighted a lot of interdependencies that we have between countries, with people on the move and people moving around, and how much this has an impact on our economies across all these different sectors. And then you have also the fact that, why do migrants tend to move? They move for better opportunities, for family reasons, because they're escaping things, because they're being persecuted, or because of disaster or famine, etc. And these migrants, these people, all they want is a chance to live their life just as dignified as anyone else, and actually achieve sending back, billions in remittances to their families, which also then end up going to supporting things like, school fees or food, or being able to, have a home or have shelter, access services and things. And so in terms of the work that we do in migration governance, but related to the SDGs, as I mentioned here, or a couple of things I haven't mentioned yet, addressing the health and well-being of migrants really is a precondition for any person to be able to work, to be able to enjoy life, etc. And if we don't include migrants in that access to this kind of health service, then we are leaving them behind, and they also put everyone else at risk with communicable diseases. Just take the case of COVID-19 and access to vaccines and access to services and support and hospitalization, etc. Then there's SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth. We support employment opportunities, labor mobility, employment at home, entrepreneurship of migrants, refugees, returnees, etc., to include for livelihoods opportunities. And actually, more often than not, you can actually look at the history of innovation and businesses that have been created in different countries, even including America, where the grand majority of this has been immigrants, or whether they are first, second, or third, nationality, like immigrants. It's quite astounding actually how much entrepreneurship and how much innovation and new knowledge and skills migrants can actually bring to a country. We also work with cities and local actors, making sure that cities actually integrate migration into urban planning, disaster risk reduction, etc., and can actually contribute to urban development. And the reason why this is really, really key, and that it contributes to this SDG, is because the majority of migrants and refugees now go to cities. The world is living in a situation where more than half of us live in a city or an urban place, and that includes migrants and displaced persons, because that is the place where they get more opportunities. And so this is also a place where the particularities of urban planning and urban sprawl, urban growth, urban segregation, social mobility, upwards mobility, etc., it all takes place, and the inequalities that migrants can face around that can really severely limit their capacity to work, to live a dignified life, and to contribute to that city, to that society. So we need to make sure that that's not the case. Obviously, quality education, migrants. I mean, just take the case of Malala Yousafzai, which I'm sure you all know, who is the I think it's Pakistani refugee who got shot in relation to an incident where she has become an international symbol for girls and education, in terms of making sure that children, but also particularly girls who tend to also have less access to education, or tend to be put into a different kind of gender role, are not able to access that. And so how do we make sure that our education systems definitely include migrants, migrant children, migrant adults, and that they have the skills and the education to also achieve their potential like anyone else? So these are just, and finally, relating to diaspora, which I will say is, diaspora, engaging with diaspora, supporting diaspora, empowering diaspora is a massive component, obviously, of what IOM does and many other actors do, and diaspora themselves, diaspora associations themselves. And so SDG 17, in terms of partnerships for the goals, we really need to realise that there's a lot of migrants and diaspora associations out there that can do so much. And often we don't include them, we don't talk to them, we don't empower them. And it means that they do things on their own to support the governments and the countries, which is really good, but they're not necessarily always in line with what's already going on in a country. And so how do we do this more effectively? How do we engage with diaspora much more effectively so that they're informed, that we have a good relationship with them, and they're able to support development, or they're able to put into motion their ideas to support their communities back home, or even the communities where they are, again, always contributing to sustainable development. So this is like the reasoning why. All of this is how IOM and how the international community sees migration governance in relation to supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the other key areas, and an example of like a joint IOM and UN program that I wanted to share with you was how we've been sort of for many years now pioneering the what we call the mainstreaming migration into policy coherence. Mainstreaming migration for policy coherence methodology, or this mainstreaming methodology. And the reason is that when we talk about policy coherence, then it goes back to saying that migration affects all different sectors: employment, health, education, etc. And all those policies. So the policies around health, the policies around migration, the policies around security, the policies around anything also can have an impact on migration. They might empower migrants, or they might disempower migrants. They might discriminate against migrants, or they might actually ensure provision of services for migrants together with other parts of the populations. And so if we don't understand how those different policies interact with each other, and how maybe there may be some gaps, that there might be some policy incoherence, that some policies might undermine migration policies or development policies, or vice versa. If we don't understand that, then we can't understand how to have better migration governance. Because, you know, as I mentioned again before, in the migration governance, not only has it tended to be sort of siloed and very specific to specific migration policies, with, you know, very like unique in itself, which is good to have, and this has been a key thing and a key steps forward in terms of ensuring, you know, diaspora engagement policies or migrant labour mobility policies. These are essential to help regulate and to help ensure safety and human rights. But if we don't consider how other policies are affecting this, then we're not seeing the full picture. And so, together with support of different partners, funding from the Swiss Development Corporation, from the European Union, in partnership with other UN agencies, you know, for since about 2008, I think it is, we've been working in different global programs to try to come up with a method to mainstream migration into these different policy areas. Because if we say that migration governance is about having, you know, solid policy frameworks around migration, we can't do this again in silo outside of all the other policies that exist. It needs to be coherent. So what we've been trying to do is we've been working with many governments at national and local level to try to support national level policy coherence across different sectors, as well as at the local level, and also to support better local national discussion and local national coordination and coherence around migration governance. And the local aspect is extremely important because it's at the local level where migration governance is actually physically takes place. The services provided, the cohesion that exists or doesn't exist, the entrepreneurship, that's where migrants actually react with and interact with the rest of the population and vice versa. It's in local constituencies, you know, villages, towns, cities, where you actually get the impact, both the positive and the negative of migration. And so, yet at the same time, policy around migration tends to be so national, so sovereign, and so so sort of politicized that the national level can also be quite different from what the local authority, for example, wants to do or is trying to do to ensure that all of its citizens, regardless of where they came from, have access, have health, are able to work, are able to contribute, can send their kids to school. So being able to make sure that the national policies respond to real, actual local needs is also a really important part of migration governance, basically. Excuse me. And so we've been doing this with this mainstreaming aspect. And essentially it's about going into a country that wants to improve its migration governance and working with a country to sort of understand, okay, so what policies are in place around migration, what other policies are in place, where are the gaps, what policies affect what policies, are the policies being implemented, how are they being implemented or not? And you might have good policies, but you might have problems in actually getting access to services or implementing those policies, etc. So I think, you know, the whole understanding around that then leads us to basically then support governments to start integrating migration considerations into development planning, into health planning, into urban planning, and we do that by refining policies, developing new policies, integrating elements into programming, creating consultation mechanisms, making sure that across the board, across the government, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Employment, and not just the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and all the other ministries, they understand the stake when it comes to mobility and how migration and mobility affects their areas and how they have actually a stake as well in migration governance because of their policies and what they do. So this is a method that we've been pioneering in a few different programs, and one of the specific programs that I manage that the colleagues mentioned at the beginning is this Making Migration Work for Sustainable Development, basically, which is a global joint program led by Iom and Undp and supported by SDC. And we're now in phase 3. So this has been going on for quite a while now. And the idea is that we basically, again, supporting policy coherence and policy legislation and frameworks around migration governance that are not only about just the migration policies, but looking also beyond that and looking at other types of policies and trying to set up a more, you know, migrant-friendly governance framework in general that supports the inclusion and empowerment also of migrants together with the rest of the population. And so what we're doing is, and I'm sorry because I think this slide is not that clear, but basically we do a few different things in this program. And we work across different countries. And what we do is we continue to refine policies. So we do the policy work, the mainstreaming work, continuing to integrate and analyze the policies and see how, like, where the gaps are and what the problems are and where services are missing, etc. And then we've been trying to actually, and this through this mainstreaming methodology, we've been then trying to pilot and actually roll out specific initiatives together with local authorities, regional authorities, national authorities, Iom, Undp, and SDC, and other actors like civil society, private sector, and diaspora, to actually try to really showcase what we mean when we say, okay, we've mainstream migration into policy on health, for example, and now we're going to roll out that policy at the local level to ensure that health services are inclusive also for migrants, and we want to try to capture the results of that in relation to the 2030 agenda. What does that mean for health and health for all if we can really mainstream migration into these areas to ensure inclusive policies? And we really are not leaving anyone behind. And that is the crux of migration governance. It's about governing migration in a way that makes it really part and parcel of everything we're doing for everyone, and that the policies in any government are inclusive and friendly and supportive to all populations. And, you know, of course, this goes beyond migrants. We just happen to be obviously the mandated with specifically for migrants, but of course, then you can talk about other types of populations that also need to be supported. And then what we do is these piloting initiatives that we do, we actually are also mapping out the diaspora and the private sector in the areas we were working in, and trying to then have an implementation plan to engage them so that for the success of those initiatives. Because again, especially for diaspora, we tend to have diaspora initiatives that are maybe a bit disconnected from the local community, or that are not necessarily in line with like the needs, or they're in line with the needs, but the government doesn't support them or doesn't know about them, and so they can link up to them and make them more effective, essentially. So it's about really trying to connect different actors, whether it's diaspora, local authorities, private sector, civil society, migrants themselves, and the communities, for a much more integral approach to what we used to consider migration governance was. Again, so that it really becomes part and parcel of what we're doing generally for any kind of governance approach. This program works in 11 countries. You can see the countries here. We will share, hopefully the colleagues can also share in the chat, and if not, we'll share afterwards a bit more information like our brochure and the information where you can go to get more information on like the very specific things that we do. But I did want to just talk about a couple of examples. I'll maybe just jump to Morocco, since we were talking about, excuse me, some examples here. So in Morocco, for example, we have been helping the government basically mainstream migration, actually create a specific migration and health policy at regional level in a few different regions. And then in one of the regions, we've actually been supporting them to, oh sorry, is someone speaking or? No, okay. To then roll out an to actually support basically the strengthen and sort of share the psychosocial approach to healthcare and assistance for women and children victims of violence, but also inclusive of, for example, migrants. And so we've been doing it from a health perspective, in terms of like really looking at initiatives that are inclusive and upscaling and enhancing health centres and the whole sort of health system in a particular region. And in another region, we've been looking at entrepreneurship and trying to build employment areas and cooperatives and credits and well, not credits because it's not loans, but sort of financial support to actually create businesses which include migrants or returnees, but also the local population in regions where there's a lot of poverty and there tends to be a lot of irregular migration as well. So really trying to create, in particular with a focus on youth, because especially in North Africa and particularly in Morocco, Tunisia, etc., you have a massive youth bulge and you have a lot of youth who are qualified and have studied but are just really lack opportunities. And so how do we ensure that they have opportunities at home or abroad that can really fulfill their expectations? And we do this through working, as I mentioned, with all these different actors and engaging with private sector and local authorities. And the idea is that we will use these results to show that this is supporting to, the SDG 1 on no poverty. It's about ensuring good health and inclusive health for everyone. It's about, making sure we're reducing inequalities between the different types of populations, including migrants. And so again, it's coming down to how do we do migration governance and migration programming in relation to sustainable development? Because if we can link it to that, then that will be the best kind of results that we can get. Because it's not just about migration governance for migration governance sake, it's about why do we do migration governance and what can that contribute to in terms of equalities, in terms of human rights, and in terms of sustainable development. And this is just one area that we do, which is supporting the governments, right? This is like mainstreaming migration into government policies at national and local level. But at the same time, we're now a UN agency. And at the same time, if we have this whole approach where we're saying, oh, migration needs to be an essential part of the UN in general, the UN development system in general, it needs to be contributing to the 2030 agenda, then that means we also need to support the UN country teams and the UN development system by also making sure that at the country level, when we do common country analysis and we have the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation frameworks, that migration is in there too. The migration is considered as part of how we work across the UN and across the actors with the government to support their generic sustainable development approaches. It also means that we look at positioning, let's say, ourselves, and not ourselves in that sense, but positioning basically migration again as this cross-cutting thing across the UN as well, and we can really build on the aspect of doing that through the United Nations Network on Migration, which is for the Global Compact on migration. Now, I know that you are going to do a session on the Global Compact on migration or in the GCM, so I'm going to only touch on it very lightly to help explain the reason why we do the work that we do. Obviously, as you know, the GCM, they'll call it now, or maybe you've already looked at it a little bit already in the course. It really was the first ever UN sort of framework that's been adopted specifically on global migration governance, which is quite a miracle in itself, considering the time that it happened, was just in and around the migration crisis, basically. And it was spurred by the migration crisis in terms of what was happening in Syria, etc., and in the process to get to the point that it was adopted. But then, you know, you may not share the same vision, but at the same time, I feel like over the past years, even though we have the Global Compact on Migration now, migration and politics has just become even more polarized, even more politicized. And so it's actually, it was both a sort of like an excellent thing to happen, but also really surprising given the governmental setup around the world. But essentially, we as IOM, you know, want to, so I think the slides have moved again a bit, sorry. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second and say that I don't want to talk too much about the Global Compact since you're going to do that. But essentially, because IOM, as the UN agency that does migration governance, is now mandated with being the coordinator of the GCM, and the GCM and the UN network, it means that we are basically responsible for bringing together all the other actors within the UN and outside the UN, etc., around the topic of migration governance, so that it can help the sustainable development, basically, goals. And of course, we're wanting to talk about other international agencies as well. So these are just some. The list is not exhaustive by any means, but essentially, now, if IOM has the mandate to connect all these actors and to support migration governance, there are a lot of international organizations out there, increasingly more so now that we have the Global Compact on Migration, and now that migration has been recognized as supporting sustainable development within the 2030 agenda. So many more agencies have actually started looking at this, working on it, bringing their added value to it. And so you can see things like the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, do a lot around migration policy. They actually have a really good tool on policy coherence as well that we supported. Of course, you have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who have the very specific mandate around protecting and assisting refugees around the world. You have the International Committee of the Red Cross, who doesn't only, of course, deal with migration, but does a lot of humanitarian work in relation to supporting people on the move. You have us, you have Undp. Undp is one of our biggest partners, I have to say, at least in the work that we do within IOM now. And they really are, you know, bringing the support in terms of the program that we do, but also they do many other things in related to displacement, to local governance around migration. We've worked with them around diaspora engagement, around transfer of skills. And so another key actor where they come at it from a very much from a governance perspective as one of the key areas that UNDP does. You've also got the UN Population Fund or UNFPA, and they basically, they look at, it's more of a data aspect. So they look at it from a perspective of population and census and like the inequalities around the different types of populations and the mobility of those populations and how that affects you know, stock of people in countries and migration stock, etc. And they do a lot around as well kind of the sort of sexual and reproductive health aspect, which also has which women and children or girls, migrants, actually can you know, need a lot more assistance in as well. So they do a lot there. You've got the World Bank, who has got a sort of a whole network on knowledge and migration policy. And so they do a lot of research and they do a lot of work on remittances, etc. You've got the Migration Policy Institute based in Washington, and they sort of, IOM works a lot with the MPI on analysing migration policy and looking at, you know, innovation in policy and coming up with policy proposals and things around key issues around migration governance. You've got the Food and Agricultural Organization as well, and they look on, you know, they look at rural-urban migration. You've got IFAD, which they do a lot on remittances as well. You've got WHO, which is the World Health Organization, and they do lots of things related to migrant health. You've got ILO and the International Labour Organization, who do a lot around, who are the custodians of the labour conventions, which also includes conventions and specific things around migrant workers as well. We also have quite a lot of things like at the local level, like cities of local networks working on migration. You have a Mayors Migration Council bringing in mayors together around migration governance as well. And so really you've got massive amount of actors actually working in this area. And again, I'm just going to stop here for a second because I know there's plenty that we haven't covered, but I want to ask if there's any comments or questions or things on anything so far, because I'm conscious of the fact that I'm talking a lot, but I still want to give the space to be asked questions. So I see Tapiwa has a hand up, I think too. And please help me, Karine, with the moderation.
Thank you so very much, Joanne, for the expose. My question then is to say that when we look at the international agencies, does it necessarily mean that there is an entry point or there is an entry institution through which, say, as a state or as different players, you want to engage the UN system with regards to migration? Do we have a penetration point? Do we have an institution among all these institutions that you've named that will be regarded as the institution through which all migration-related issues are held, or states or players are free to interact with whoever of the agencies without any causing any conflict or problems? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Really quickly, I would obviously say IOM, but basically because IOM as the UN agency has this coordinator role now around the GCM and around global governance. So if IOM is in a country, and we are in a lot of countries, we have over 500 offices worldwide, we will be a great connection point, but we're not the only ones, and we do work together. And so depends what country you're in, depends what context you're in, it depends what actors are there. But we should be working more together. And I do have a few slides on the UN reform after this, but hopefully that answered your question. It's not a black and white sort of response, but IOM is a great entry point. It will depend what kind of area you want to go into on migration. And so there's so many different partners out there. And usually we do connect to each other. And at the country level in particular, the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework is the thing where we say, this is the plan to support this country reach sustainable development. Therefore, anyone involved in that, including IOM and other actors, that's your entry point if you want to make an impact, basically, to work to support that plan. And you can do that from different entry points. I see Tinashe, but I also see Karine online. I don't know if you're moderating or if you want me to stop talking yet.
No. I was looking at the questions and the comments. So please, Tinashe.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks a lot. Very exciting presentation. But I think for me, I was sort of hoping that you would sort of try and problematize the role that international agencies play in the whole scheme of things when it comes to migration, particularly when we're looking at the production of data and how that data is sort of collected at level, at the UN level, and how that data is eventually used to inform decisions and interventions at different levels. And having said that, I think there is a huge problem when it comes to the use of data and the production of the data itself. And I will cite two specific examples. I read a book called The Wisdom of Wars. The Wisdom of Wars by Elizabeth Pisani. And she is talking about bureaucrats, brothels, and the business of AIDS. And in this book, she is making specific reference to a UN agency that was sort of spearheading the AIDS response, and how the UN agency was also complicit in sort of the production of data that sort of perpetuated a particular agenda. And for me, if you're coming to migration, you look at, for instance, some of the data that is sort of churned out around number of refugees and how, in some cases, some of these agencies are also conflicted, or they have a vested interest in terms of production of certain numbers so that they also sort of mobilize resources or get funding. And I'll give a very specific example of South Africa, which is also my field study, where at some point you had numbers of refugees coming from different countries inflated by the UNHCR, for instance. So for me, I wanted you to sort of problematize, this notion of the role of these big agencies in production of data, collection of data, and what that means. I know maybe, for instance, in your case, you also sort of have invested interest, but I would be interested in sort of discussing this notion of how this data is produced, how it is collected, and how it eventually sort of speaks to different agendas at different levels, which I think is very real, not imagined, but we have sort of seen some of these issues. Thanks.
Thanks so much. That's a brilliant question that I don't know if we would be able to answer all of those points. And also, but I'm going to try a few, and it would be great to keep talking about it. Yes, data. So in terms of migration, and of course, I cannot speak for UNHCR in terms of inflated numbers around etc. But data on migration is very difficult even just to gather, first of all. So a lot of the work that we do as IOM, where we're trying to actually support governments understand how to capture data on migration, as well as also understand how to analyze the data on migration so that they can have better policies that respond to migration. And so the agenda that we have, because every organization has an agenda, the agenda that we have is to know what's happening in migration so that we can support better migration governance. So obviously the data that we want to collect has to show, what are the needs, why are people migrating, and why are they going to certain places, what is the impact of that migration flow in this place to that area. All of that is, it can be very political. And it's not about having fake data or false data. It's about capturing and understanding the data in a way that allows for us, literally, quite essentially, to convince a government that migrants are not bad and that good migration policies and good migration governance is a good thing for everyone. So that is our agenda in that sense. And it's definitely not about having the wrong data or inflated data. It's about how does any organization, use data to help its mandate, because we are mandated to support migrants. So the more data that shows the needs of migrants, the stories of migrants, the way that migrants are treated, the way that migrants are discriminated against, that can only be good. But it is actually very difficult to get data on migration. And that's kind of data and research that we can do ad hoc. And it's not only IOM that does it. You've got many different other organizations that look at migration data. But how data is actually officially collected around the SDGs as well is data on migration in terms of the indicators that are relevant and that are in the 2030 agenda are self-reported. The governments self-report on that data, and then they come to the high-level political forum on the 2030 agenda, which takes place every year, and they say, this is what we've done in SDG 5 and SDG 10 and SDG whatever, and this is and they add, if they want to, issues on migration. So what a government does in relation to data on migration and reporting on data and reporting on what it does in migration is also self-reported, which is good, but also can be problematic, because of course then you can miss information out. And I think that yes, there's agendas everywhere, and I think that the role that we all play, so there's a role of a government that becomes highly politicized around migration. There's the role of IOM around data on migration, but yet we serve member states. So we can't just go around pointing the finger at our governments, because then they won't talk to us, then they won't let us support their migrants, then they won't let us in. Then you've got civil society, which can point the finger, because that is the role they should be doing, and they should be using data to do that. And so, you know, I think that we need to consider the roles and responsibilities of each agency, and that is, of course, not discounting, you know, any agencies or just mistakes or errors around inflating or wrong data. You know, there's no, you know, I can't speak to that because it's not something that we do, or like that I am aware of course. But I think data needs to be taken into consideration around many different factors, and it's about the role of the organisation, what we're trying to do, what anyone is trying to do, and also getting the information about the real needs and the real effects of migration on sustainable development and vice versa. And that for us is what we would say is our, at least in our case, that would be the way to look at it. And then there's data which is more the media. And the media and governments and civil society and the polarized way that we look at things. I don't think that when it comes to migration, we can say that this is only in migration that data is an issue. Misinformation, you know, fake news, social media, digitalization, that is an issue that goes beyond, I think, this discussion in itself. But it's also in the situation that we find ourselves in as IOM and other UN agencies. And I think it's not only a question for migration, is what I say, is what I would answer. But there's many more things we could say, but I want to take some more questions, and I'd be happy to chat more after this if needed. So please, Karine, if you can let the next speakers come
Yes,
in.
exactly. I have seen that Uptal raised his or her hand. So please.
Thank you very much for the presentation also. I don't know, my first one, I have two actually issues to discuss. First one is comments or questions. I can see according to the presentation or my experience that climate change has its impact on livelihoods, rural people livelihoods, then its impact on the migration, particularly male migration, and so on. So it needs a lot of cooperation between the there are many agencies working internationally for all of these separately. It needs the cooperation among themselves. It also needs the cooperation within the national level, also interministerial cooperation. But in some cases or in specific cases, you can see that the cooperation is very less among the organization or agencies. So is there any mechanism for IOM for this cooperation issues? This is my first question or comments. Secondly, I can see development and migration. The relation between these two issues is some positive and also a negative to the local peoples. If there development, local people may migrate from specific areas or something. So how do you see actually this issue, this relation? These two actually are my question and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think thank you for the great questions as well, particularly the last one, and I'll jump on that. Yes, absolutely, and I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. You can have positive and negative effects of migration, and what we see or what we say is we need to mitigate, like we need to minimize the negative and maximize the positive for everyone's benefit. And the only way to do that is to understand migration, to have data on migration, to understand how migration affects other sectors, how we can do better migration governance, how we do better migration policies, and integrate migration into other policies like health and education, etc., so that we have a framework, a governance framework that is integral and sort of understands all of those negative and positive potential areas and tries to mitigate them. So this is exactly the crux of what we're trying to say. When we can maximize the benefit if we understand the effects and if we manage it better, then we don't have to have these negative impacts. We can make it as positive as possible for everyone involved and for sustainable development. For I'm not so totally sure if I completely understood your question on climate change, and I think it comes from a perspective of climate change and environment. It's also a really big cross-cutting area. Everybody needs to get on board with this now, and I think you were asking if there's a mechanism for IOM to engage in this topic. Is that correct?
I think IOM mechanism Yes.
So, okay, so IOM, because it's a UN agency, and we do have a whole department which is on migration, environment, and climate change, and we interact in the UN platforms. So we were present in COP26. We were present in basically the UN discussions around climate change and around the environment. And we also, as a UN agency, like every other UN agency, needs to consider when we do things, when we do support, when we do cooperation, when we support governments, we should be also thinking about the sustainability aspect and the environmental impact of the work that we do. So internally as well, that's what we are trying to do as best as possible to make sure that anything that we do around the work is thinking about that as well. But we don't have, IOM doesn't create its own platform. We are involved in the other platforms created within the UN system on everything around, for example, like the COP26, which is of course state-led, but the UN supports, versus things like, you know, everything up and around to the Paris Agreement, you know, implementing the agreements there, hopefully now implementing the agreements around COP26 and supporting our governments achieve that, basically. Over.
There are several questions in the chat, with one related to the Belarus border. So what is your response or comment on the current refugee crisis in Belarus border, and what is the role of IOM over there?
Oh, that's a hard one. This is difficult because, so first of all, personally, not as an IOM, as another person, personally, or maybe this just goes back to the comment on how migration is being politicized, right? So we have a member state purposely using migration to make a political statement, essentially. So in that, our role is, and I don't work in that country specifically, but basically the role of the chief of mission in those countries, as well as the regional director for Europe and our European and in Vienna, we have two offices who would be supporting the European and the Eastern Europe countries. They are all basically in discussions right now. And what we can do as IOM, because again, we are the UN. We can't tell a government what to do because it is their sovereign right around migration. For now, that's how it works, because there is no, you know, the UN has not been given the power to sort of like basically say to a government, you can't do this. What we can do is we can advocate, we can support, we can provide services, we can go to that border and provide food and clothing and shelter for the people who are stranded there. We will be working behind the scenes politically to try to discuss with the heads of state, with the ministries, and etc. So there will be a lot of lobbying and political dialogue in the background happening. But because we are part of an international organization, there is a diplomacy aspect that is not something that we can't avoid being part of an international organization that supports and responds to member states. So if a member state says to us, you know, this is what we want to do on migration governance, of course there are things that we will not do. You know, we will not deport people, we will not do certain things that go against the principles of the UN and of human rights principles, but we also don't have the power to stop a government from having their own specific policies around these things. And the point at which people can intervene beyond the sovereignty aspect starts becoming about the Security Council of the UN, which goes way above and beyond the capacity and mandate of a UN agency. A UN agency like IOM, it's about politics, advocacy, support, pleas, you know, like it's what we can do as an implementer. We're an implementing agency that is on the ground supporting, helping, analysing, capturing data, trying to solve problems, trying to connect actors together to support those migrants. But if you want an intervention at state level, this would have to come from states and from the Security Council, basically.
Okay, there is a question from Pushpa Parekh. Does IOM take into consideration the resistance of developing countries to the hegemonic nature of the WHO and IMF in dictating how economic aid is used in a developing country, imposing a global north blinkered view of Global South?
Can I take that question when I move to my next couple of slides?
No problem for me. Otherwise, there is another one from Iman Ahmed. I still see the IOM mandate in this area as too loose, too ambitious, and difficult to pin down. How do you measure your impact in this area? I am specifically interested in impact indicators, not process indicators.
Excellent question. This is what we're working on. So the mandate that we have, I think I completely understand that it does look quite large and ambitious. Essentially, you know, we work, the work that we do and the mandate that we will have, or the work that we can do in any given country, will depend on the needs. So it's not like we're saying that we do absolutely everything in every single country in relation to migration. That would be impossible. But if we're in country X, and that country X has an emigration problem. They've got a low population, the employment's not very high, lots of emigration is happening, and they're losing people, they're losing doctors, they're losing nurses, they're losing teachers. They have a sort of like economic problem from the perspective of their workforce, declining, you know, aging populations, which happens in some instances. Then we would be helping them to tackle that specifically. So, you know, we're looking at the policies around retention of workers, the policy, working with maybe the countries where the immigrants are going to try to, you know, encourage and support, like, you know, bilateral sort of agreements around supporting return, you know, bringing pension benefits back with them. There's many different things you can do in a very given specific context around migration. And we need to be quite adaptive and sort of responsive to the actual needs. But IOM doesn't work alone. IOM is part of the UN, and IOM also works with the UN across different sectors. So, you know, we are not the experts on, rural development, but we work a lot with rural to urban migration. So when we work with the Food and Agriculture Organization, we bring their expertise, we bring our expertise, and we try to tackle a specific problem around displacement, for example. Or we work with civil society. A lot of the time, access to migrants, being able to support migrants in certain circumstances is very sensitive. They don't want to be found, they don't want to be spoken to. We sometimes need to work with civil society to access and to work with certain types of populations. So yes, we have a large mandate, but we don't apply the large mandate everywhere. What we do is we apply what we can do and the expertise and the network of colleagues and actors that we work with to solve problems within a UN context and within a context of the government. It has migration issues and concerns, but also has many other concerns like health, like employment, etc. And so we have the mandate there to say, well, you need to think about the migrants. You need to think about mobility. How can we help you think about mobility to help you think about how to do better programming? And that, I don't think, is a mandate that's too broad. I think is about, and maybe linking to the next couple of slides, I wanted to say it's about becoming a better UN, one UN, more joined up approach, and much more flexible and better at what we're doing to support the government. And the impact aspect, definitely, I think that IOM and the UN, I mean, we have to report against the SDGs. And so at the country level, IOM will be and is working towards more and more integrating the work that we do and the results and the activities and the well-being and everything that we have an impact on into UN Info. And it's this online platform where you basically put the results of the work that you do that shows how you are supporting the government achieve the plan that the UN and the government have come up with together, basically. And so that is the first port of call to show the results of what we're doing comes in there. We're actually part of the work that we do as a unit, so from the Migration and Sustainable Development unit, is that we've created lots of different tools around monitoring and evaluation, around indicators. We have a whole actual tool, and maybe if the colleagues are still listening, we have a tool now on disaggregating within the SDGs around migratory status. We have a whole migration data portal. There's lots of different tools and things we're working on basically to get the data, but also to help reporting and to actually show the impact for the communities that we're working with, the well-being of the migrants, the access to services, how good those services are, how this has helped people, get jobs, become healthier, go to school, be educated, get a job abroad. There's a lot of things that we report on in that sense that explain, and what we need to do now, essentially, because we're now a part of the UN, is to articulate that better in relation to sustainable development goals. And we're working a lot on that, but there is definitely a lot we're continuing to enhance, but there's a lot of reports and things out there where you can see what we've specifically done to support communities and migrants.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a very quick question, because you have talked very relevantly about policy coherence and what you do to ensure it. And what I would like to know is, how do you assess? So I know it can be very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically we have been working, so there's two ways of looking at it. There's assessing, so there are tools that exist. We have a whole, and this is sensitive, right? Because what we're assessing is a government capacity and a government setup. So we created, IOM has what we call this set of like migration governance indicators, which we didn't want to call it an index, because then you start kind of saying, oh, one government's better than another government, and etc. And while we know that, of course, you can compare and contrast governments, migration is a sensitive topic, and we didn't want to create an index which was too sort of like competitive in that sense, but much more identifying gaps and supporting, how to move forward in relation to policy coherence, right? So we have the migration governance indicators, which is one of our tools, which basically looks at where does migration in the policies? What kind of migration policies do you have? What kind of other policies consider migration? How do they link up to, do they work on the Global Compact on Migration? Is migration integrated into the work they do in the Sustainable Development? So there's a whole tool and set of indicators that we have that you can basically take any country and assess and say, okay, this one, yes, this is good. Oh no, this is maybe a gap. Is this relevant for this country? Maybe not. Okay, and so there's the whole assessment that we can do using the migration governance indicators. And there is also a tool that was developed by OECD and Undp and one other actor that I can't remember, sorry, who actually have also created a whole tool around policy coherence in migration and development. And again, hopefully the colleagues are listening and can share, but we will share afterwards. If not, I'm so sorry I can't see the chat because I'm doing full screen. And so there's that tool as well. And there's other tools and things where basically it's almost a combination of things, because there's also in some country offices, we've actually hired people to do like a concrete sort of study, like a snapshot of policy coherence right now, right? Where, like, what's good, what's bad, what's undercutting, what do we need to improve? And then you set about improving. Now we can't fix everything, obviously, but we can say, okay, what are the priorities in relation to if a country, for example, as I mentioned, in Morocco, they really do have a lot of health issues in certain regions that are poorer. And we had to come up with a whole migration and health policy specifically because the policies that you had in place were not working. In other countries, for example, in Serbia, they've actually done things where they've actually created, they've integrated the policies into the into health policies, into et cetera. And so as we assess the policy coherence, and we can do that with different tools, then it becomes a desk review and understanding the migration challenges, because the problem is it's such a complex issue. You could go on and on and on for pages and pages of all the policies that exist. So you need to be targeted. You need to say, okay, what are the migration issues? What are the main policy areas? How do these interact? And then you say, okay, we need to do this, 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 and this, because these are the most urgent things that are going to actually help the policy framework and make it much more sustainable and much more friendly towards migrants. And then so that, which is one area. So that is assessing policy coherence to then act, to then support. And then maybe the other question, or maybe slightly, is how do we assess if what we've done in mainstreaming migration into policy X or creating a new policy or et cetera has an impact, right? How do we do that? And this is the exact reason for the program that I manage right now, which is we're trying to showcase, now that we've done policy, we've done mainstreaming for policy coherence, we're now rolling it out at the pilot country level, at the local level, and we want to actually showcase what that means in terms of well-being in relation to the SDGs. And so this is taking this methodology that we've been building for the past 10 years and sort of actually putting it into, okay, so how does that contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals? What have we actually achieved? And we've created a whole indicator bank along the key areas that we work in. And we want to build on the experience of this program actually to help build further capacity around indicators around migration and sustainable development that will help the overall organization, which goes back to the question from the other colleague. Over.
Thank you very much. I think that you would like to show some more slides, right?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think we've only got a few minutes left, but I wanted to respond maybe very concretely to the sort of like, yes, the problem around the very patriarchal way that development cooperation has taken hold and the very, you know, Western approach. And what I wanted to say is there is a reform happening again. There's been a few, but here we are again, reform, the next reform with our current UN Secretary General. And he, you know, he's been implementing this and proposing this since 2017. And you know, the idea is that we need to do this better. We absolutely need to move away from how we used to do things. I mean, IMF and like, you know, everything from right at the beginning when we used to do development, or it was assistance, it was patriarchal, it was let me help you, let me come and support you, let me tell you what to do, let me, you know, and that came along with, you know, the history of colonization, the history of the world as it stands right now. And and so of course we need to adapt to that. We need to start actually having cooperation properly, horizontal, equal cooperation, and not being the rich or the global north versus the global south, etc. And I think one of the key things that the 2030 agenda gives us, and I'm not saying that we are achieving this and we're doing it perfectly and that there's not so much still more to do, there absolutely is, but the 2030 agenda and this UN reform is all about equality and togetherness and universalism. And so the 2030 agenda is based on a principle of universality, which means it is applicable for every country, every single country. It's for the whole world. It's not the global south and the global north are fine. And of course, there are countries in the global north that think they are fine and they don't need to do the SDGs, but that's wrong, of course. And so it's a process. It's a process of getting to the point where cooperation and development is about partnerships. It's about, you know, it stops being assistance, if I can say like that, right? And it's a process. We can't fix this in one day. And this is not something, this is not just a UN issue. This is a global issue. I mean, we still live in a world where we have such inequality across the global north and south, such inequality between men and women and other non-binary genders. We still have so much inequality and discrimination across races. And so this is about the reform in itself, and the work that we do is about reforming ourselves as well as trying to actually support the goals for everyone else. So we need to also deal with our own institutional things which reflect the society as it is. The UN is not exempt from racism or sexism or etc. because we all live in this world, and we all live in a world that has this, that's going through hopefully this improvement, you know, with different movements, with bettering things, with more education, with women being more educated, with better equalities and combating racial prejudice. We are hopefully getting to the point where it really starts becoming much more equal, and that is the point. And one of the ways that I think the Secretary General talks about this is, and in particular for migration, so this is the reform. You can see on the screen here what is different in terms of, like, you know, the way that UN has been doing things previously, etc. And some of these things are very technical, and you know, we don't have to go into all the details. But what I wanted to point out is that number 2 here, number 1, which says from assistance to cooperation. That is a recognition, as I just mentioned before, that we need to move away from this sort of like patriarchal Western hegemonic sense of how we've done things, and start really, really believing in and making it possible to be about partnerships. And then number two, from going from an internal UN sense, from going from individual UN inputs to a collective and coherent response. It's all about the one UN. It's about working together, not just with the UN, so across the UN, but also with other actors, civil society, private sector, governments, migrants, all types of populations, etc. And it's about number three, from going from the single issues to sectoral issues and SDG integration. And migration is just an example. As I mentioned before, migration just tends to be this one thing we did, you know, this one policy area, this siloed thing. No, we need to bring it into what we do, but we also need to bring in climate change, but we also need to bring in gender. And so there's all these key areas that, and all of these things should hopefully make the fact that when we talk about sustainable development, it's, you know, it's all those factors. You can't just do sustainable development for some people. You can't just do sustainable development for migration only in one sense, or for, you know, sector and health, or for, because all of these sectors are interrelated. And the other principle around the SDGs isn't, in fact, their interdependence of each and every one of the 17 sustainable development goals, because we can't achieve, you know, SDG 8 on decent work if we don't have SDG 1, 2, 3 on poverty, on health, and on hunger, right? They're all interrelated. We can't just do a few of these SDGs. We have to do them all, and we have to build that slowly and build the collection and the collaboration slowly, basically. And one of the other key things from the UN reform in relation to migration, which is also the first time they're kind of saying it this way, is number 9 here, where they're saying factoring in issues across borders. Because if you think that, you know, the UN or the development cooperation community or the international community, we do things, you know, we are a bit siloed, right? We do education, and we do health, and we do migration, and we do whatever. But then countries between their borders do their own thing as well. Countries are like, oh, well, we're just going to do it this way. We're not going to listen to this thing. We're going to do migration this way. We're going to do health this way. We're going to do whatever. But the problem with that is we live in a world which is utterly and completely interdependent across all countries. We depend on other countries for food, other countries for energy, other countries for people, for mobility, for workers, for everything. And so if we don't actually think about this broader than borders, which is also useful for the migration argument, then that is also a way to think about cooperation that is not just north-south cooperation, the UN or the IMF or whatever telling other countries what to do. It's about countries coming together to address common challenges that cross all borders, like migration, like climate, health, pandemic, COVID, etc. So this is where we're going. And I know it can be frustrating that we're just not there yet, but there is no disagreement at all in that question or the fact that we should be doing this. And this is a process that we're working towards. So I hope that kind of answers a little bit that question. And I think we're a little bit out of time. There wasn't many slides left, and I think that the discussion was much more interesting probably than my slides. So I just want to stop in this last one and say, you know, IOM, as I mentioned, you know, we just want to, with our data, with the work that we do on migration, we want to make sure that mobility and that the Global Compact on Migration can be leveraged through the UN network on migration that we coordinate to support the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the essence of what we're trying to do. That's how we're working with our governments. That's what we're telling the UN, all of our UN sister agencies, and that's what we're working towards basically. And from a perspective of inclusion, equality, non-discrimination, etc., which we can all only get behind in terms of it's just better for everyone that way. So I'll stop there and hand back over to Karine in case there is space for more questions or you want to close.
I think that we can take one more question because I see that Iman Ahmed, I've put one question in the chat, which reads, if the IOM policy responds to government concerns, and while migration is mostly not problematized in Africa, I am afraid such approach mostly answers to the needs of European and American governments. How do you strictly ensure this fluidity would not harm human and people's rights?
I'm not sure I heard it all. Apologies. Can I come out of my presentation to read it? Is that okay?
Yes. Yes.
Hopefully it will. Oh, I can actually, it's coming up without. Okay. So if the Iom policy responds to government concerns, okay, yes. I am afraid that such approach mostly answers to the needs of European Union. Okay. I understand. It is so. This is actually I have trouble with this because it is because of the position that we're in, because we're a UN agency that has member states, right? So when we go into a country to work, we are allowed in. The government invites us to come in to support them with their migration policies. And of course, and actually it's funny because I think the question could actually be the other way around. It is actually a lot harder to work with and convince northern states like Europe around migration than it is to work with and completely support the needs of governments like in Africa, for example. Because indeed, the issue that we see is that often European governments or the US or the very rich countries who unfortunately kind of hold the pen on who gets in, who gets out, who do we send back, who do we readmit, who do we let in with refugees, because they are the ones that where the many, not all, of course, in fact, it's not even the majority of migrants are going, right? So it's so politicized in the Western world, and it's politicized from a perspective of politicians using it in such a bad way to create populism, to create fear for different reasons that actually have got nothing to do with actual migration, right? So we find it much more difficult working in those countries as IOM with those actors than actually with others. And it's not, we are not trying to sort of like work then with Africa, like for example, take North Africa, which is so linked to Europe because you have such a flow there and such a connection, where we often find ourselves saying, okay, well, France doesn't really want migrants more coming in, but all the Moroccans are coming from France, or many Moroccans are coming from Morocco to France. How do we get France and Morocco to talk to each other for an agreement so that everyone is happy? Because it's not about us trying to say, oh, Morocco, you have to do what France wants. It's about saying, okay, no, France is, your migrants are going to France, some of them irregularly. So how can we help this not be irregular? How can we maybe have some kind of agreement where they're protected? How can we, and this is, this is what we're trying to do, right? But this is, again, as I mentioned, IOM can only go so far. IOM can advise, can support, can facilitate, can give policy advice. In the end, we can't tell a head of state to accept a boat of migrants in the Mediterranean to come into their ports. We can't do it, unfortunately, because we have not been given that power within the UN. Member states make up the UN. The heads of states are the Security Council of the UN. So it's true that sometimes I can feel very frustrated at the lack of how much we can do certain things or how much we can control what states do. But actually, if you think about the way the UN is set up, unfortunately, it is still the states that control the UN, and it's all the states. And so we find ourselves in that very delicate position where we try to be diplomatic and bring people together as much as possible, because it's such a hard debate to have around migration, and often it's not rational. Even if you can put data on it, people are not rational about others and other races and other people and other languages, and it's so political. So we are just doing our best in a political sense and a diplomatic sense as a UN agency. But what is good is that that's just our role as a UN agency. You have Amnesty International, you have OHCHR, you have all these other actors that can be like, oh my goodness, you're doing an absolutely terrible job, you have to fix this. So we rely on all these other actors in civil society to like cause a fuss, to put the pressure on. We rely on other heads of state to also put the pressure on. And then when we have an entry point, when we have an opening, when we see a hesitation in a government saying, oh, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't do that then. We try to convince them that this is the right way to go and that we need to be more open and that we need to think about human rights, etc. So if that makes sense, that's a little bit how we work. It's very hard, and we're in a rock and a hard place, I would say, but that's our role, because we're a governmental, not a governmental organization, an international organization with government member states, but we rely on the other actors to make a fuss as well.
Okay, we are running out of time, so I don't see any other questions. So I think that we can close the session. So Joanne, thank you very much for this very interactive and very insightful lecture. And we do look forward to the lecture that will be given by your colleague. And
yeah,
yes.
thanks. Thank you thank you for the very hard questions. And we will share the information and tools afterwards, and do get in touch if there's anything else I can clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.